Hello and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing today?
Doing great. How about you, Eric?
Doing fantastic. We are wrapping up
95 degrees, and today it's about 55 degrees and raining out here.
Yes. We're wrapping up summer and heading into fall.
No, because it's supposed to be back to 80 tomorrow. So,
well, we'll see what happens.
The temperature's like a heartbeat, up and down, but
Well, remember what they say about weather in New England. If you don't like it, wait a minute, it'll change.
And that it has been doing.
So today we're going to be talking about how to get your messages across and make sure you're understood. Communications is so important, and there are so many ways to communicate that it's actually becoming more difficult to not be misunderstood. So we're going to talk about the different methods of communication, how you can make sure your message is getting across the way you intend it, and what to do when there are misunderstandings.
Yeah, and there's several different scenarios out there as far as communications goes. I mean, we have, obviously, you and I both do speaking, and so we are speaking to audiences a lot, and in those cases, you very much have to understand the audience and be prepared and that kind of thing. And then we have business situations where maybe you're working with a team of people trying to solve a problem or doing this and that, and there's a way to handle that kind of thing too. And then there's just generally one-on-one speaking when you're going to a networking meeting or just talking with different people. But there's certain ways to do things, and one of the staples as far as the way to look at things and the way to react with people goes back to one of our favorite books, and that's How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And really what's most important, no matter what you're doing, is listening to whoever you're talking to understand them. If you're working with an audience, your listening is really preparing for them and understanding what their needs are so that you can be prepared to be talking to them on their level and talking about things that they want to hear and that kind of thing. So preparation and just being very, very open to listen to what people are looking to hear is so important.
Absolutely. And of course, we've got communications issues now that Dale Carnegie never dreamt of. When you're talking to somebody one-on-one, you've got what you're saying, you've got how you're saying it, you've got your body language, the tone of your voice, your facial expressions. All of that combines to get your message across. However, when you're using email or text, you lose most of those tools. And that's where misunderstandings happen. Because when you're just typing something out, people don't see your facial expression, your body language, the tone of your voice. So it's very common to misunderstand and take something incorrectly when it's sent by a text or an email. So you really do need to understand who your audience is, who you're talking to, and also how you're communicating with them. Because knowing the medium that you're using and its limitations forces you to pay more attention to what you are saying.
Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, the more complicated the things are that you're talking about, if you're trying to work on a project or this or that or whatever, using text messages and emails are not the way to do that. I mean, the other form of media that we have now that we didn't when Dale Carnegie wrote the book is conference calls and, using online things where you can actually get faces involved. But it really, really is important. The more delicate the situation is and the more you're trying to accomplish, it's important to be able to either pick up the phone or communicate somehow besides just texting back and forth or emailing back and forth. Because as you say, it's totally impersonal and, it just doesn't work. And it's very, very easy if somebody's having a bad day to take something that's meant well and totally turn it around 180 degrees and you don't even know it.
Exactly. And the thing is, email has sort of evolved, and text messages as well, so that people try to use emojis to show what they're feeling or try to replace the tone of voice and the facial expressions. But one, emojis are incredibly limiting, and two, they're really not appropriate for business communications. So when you're trying to conduct business, you're still dealing with just the core of your message. So how do you make sure that core gets across? And rule number one, no matter what form of communication you're using, no matter how much you can see or hear the other person, rule number one is always keep it simple. So many of us, especially in business, get caught up using business jargon, using technical jargon, industry terms. The simpler you make your message, the less likely it is to be misunderstood.
Yeah, and it is all about the person that you're talking to. You know, a lot of people, as you say, if they're going to a networking meeting or this or that or whatever, they're trying to really impress themselves by knowing all the techno speak of their profession, while everybody else is, you know, falling asleep or bored or wondering what the heck the person is saying. It really is all about the person who you are trying to communicate with. And, you know, rule number one, obviously, is to listen and understand. Seek first to understand and then to be understood, which is one of Covey's 7 habits of highly effective people. And to me, that's the most important thing, because if you want somebody to really pay attention to what you're saying, they got to know that you care about what they need or what they're doing. And the best way to do that is to just get them talking and listen to them sincerely so you can understand.
And that's very important to remember. If you look, when somebody says, oh, you know, I met this person, we had this great conversation, 9 times out of 10, what that person means is they were talking and the other person was listening to them. People love to talk. When you give somebody that willing audience and you're actually listening and responding to what they're saying, the connection that you are making is huge. You cannot underestimate the power of simply listening and responding when you're in a conversation. So many people, when someone else is talking, they're inside their own head trying to think, well, what am I going to say next? And when you're thinking about that, you're not listening to what's being said. You're not responding. Communication, especially now, is two-way. So you need to be aware of what's going on, not just the message that you're trying to get across, but the message that the listener, the other person, is trying to get across.
And it will be totally clear to the person who you're talking to if you are not that way. Even if you ask them a question to get them talking, if you're looking around and so on and so forth while they're talking, they know that you're not paying attention to them and just waiting to have your turn speaking. So it's one of the biggest tips that I saw, because as you know, I research these things every week when we talk to them, is speak last. Just listen, speak last. And if you're working with somebody, there's something that you have to be working out that might be a little bit controversial or whatever, just start with an agreement to talk these things through. Seek first to understand and then be understood, as we were talking about earlier. But it all does start with the listening, and the more that you do, the better communications you're going to have, and people will gravitate to you because you'll develop that reputation, and they will really other people will want to tap into your areas of expertise.
Yes, I was talking about controversial topics, or if you're involved in trying to work something out. I was once told the best way to end an argument is to say, you may be right about that. Because that agreement takes it to another level. So now you're going, okay, well, you may be right. The other person hopefully will follow suit, and you can actually try to find common ground. That common ground is necessary in any conversation, or for that matter, any presentation. You need to have that common understanding so that your message is not lost or misunderstood. For example, when you're doing public speaking, you have to know the level of understanding of your audience. If you're talking to a group of fifth graders, you talking about advanced calculus is not going to get your point across. They won't understand. By the same token, whatever topic you're discussing, you don't want to make it too complicated for them to understand, but you also don't want to talk down to your audience. So it's very important to know at what level your audience is.
Yeah, it's so important to get them engaged. And here I have to start practicing what I'm talking about right here. Slow down to get your message across. And I know that I am a big violator of that because once I get excited, I'm like, John Madden doing a Miller Lite commercial or something like that. But when you're trying to get things solved with another person, I found a really, really good point today. It says if you want to get your point across, start by acknowledging what you're talking about and appreciating the other person's position. Specifically, a great way to do this before you talk about yourself is to summarize what your understanding of his thoughts are to yourself, and then compliment him for his reasoning for those thoughts, whether you agree with them or not, and then speak first, to positive intentions, and let that person know that you want to solve things just as much as they do. And then if you can find one thing to start on to agree with, that's so important to get things going. But summarize, if you can repeat what somebody else has just said, and even if you don't understand it, you can say, I'm trying to understand, this is what you're saying, can you explain this a little bit more to me, and so on and so forth. And this is right out of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's a great way to get things going and just really establish a very, very trusting conversation, regardless of how, your differences, how bad they are.
Right. It's never a bad idea to ask for clarification. If somebody says something and you're not quite sure what they mean, ask them to clarify that. And you can say right out, I'm not understanding what you're saying. Let them explain it to you, listen, and repeat it back so that you know you have the message right.
Yeah, and I think from it's happened to all of us, I'm sure, where we've walked up to somebody talking about things with good intentions, maybe something that we want to accomplish together, and so on and so forth, and you explain it to them, and it comes across 180 degrees different from what you thought it was, and all of a sudden you have a confrontation when you thought you're going to have a collaboration. And so that's where it's so important to you yourself, if you say that, saying, look, I mean, maybe I'm not communicating things, in the proper way here, and so on. Maybe I'm not stating it the right way. I'm not that great at communication sometimes. Just denigrate yourself a little bit to get them a little bit more relaxed about the situation, so that you can ask the questions to develop that understanding.
And that's something that's very important. You should always take on the burden on yourself. So if you're not understanding what someone is saying, you say, I'm not understanding that. I did not understand. You never go, well, you're not being clear, because that just adds a confrontation to it. Always take it on yourself. Maybe I didn't explain it properly. Maybe I'm not understanding what you said. Take it upon yourself, because the minute you start blaming the other person, you're not being clear. How can you not understand what I'm saying? It becomes a confrontation and the meaning of the message is lost.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to keep things on the up and up and positive. And that's where, if even if you don't understand what the person's saying, just repeating what they said, say, listen, you're saying this to me. I don't really quite understand it, but just by repeating exactly what they said, they know that you're trying to, get to this thing and get this thing solved and understand what's going on, so that you can come up with a solution.
Right. And if you're dealing with topics that aren't familiar, it's always a great idea to use analogies. Compare it to something that both of you understand or that your audience understands. You may not understand all the steps involved in building a business, but you understand building a structure. So use construction terms to explain it. This is like, building a house. Find something that is understood and make that comparison. Analogies are very strong ways to get people to understand because it immediately clicks with something familiar to them. By the same token, telling stories. When you make a story out of something, it's much easier for people to understand. So if you talk about, say, a very technical problem, tell a story maybe about another client that had this problem and what happened and what the results were and how it was fixed. By converting it into a story, it makes it much easier to understand and your message gets across better.
Yeah, it's effective when you're dealing one-on-one with groups, and it's especially effective if you're dealing with an audience.
Exactly. And something else to consider is that not everybody gets information the same way. Some people, when they're dealing with concepts they're not familiar with, need to see something visually. Some people need to have it explained and hear it. Other people need to have it written for them. The different methods of getting information across, people relate to them differently, and different people respond better to different versions. So if you have an audience and your audience is of visual learners, you don't want to stand there talking to them. You want graphics. You want to show them what you're talking about. If you're talking to people who learn better with writing, you want to have them write things down, produce exercises to do for them so that they're actually following up on what you're saying with their writing. The different methods of communication are very important because makes it more difficult to understand when the information is coming at you in a form that you are not accustomed to.
Yeah, it's why it's so important to know your audience. And just as you're saying, as far as, different people do different things different ways, but the more that you talk about your subject matter when you're talking with audiences, the more you're going to get familiar with what's effective as far as your delivery method and the handouts that you're giving them and how they're taking things away. So it's so important, and it's different strokes for different folks. Obviously, when you're doing a talk, some people are going to take notes and this and that, but if you can have a set of handouts that are very, very simple that just hit on the topics that you talked about, so that they have that type of a takeaway, that's a very, very good thing to do when you're talking to an audience also. But it's really, really important to just understand the audience that you're talking to and cater whatever you are talking about to that audience.
Right. And as Chip said earlier, speak slowly, take breaths, and actually leave areas where people can ask you questions, especially one on one. Take that breath and let them ask a follow up or let them comment on what you've just said. When you're dealing with an audience, that can get a little unruly. So it's very common that you just ask people to hold their questions till the end. But when you're talking one on one, it really needs to be more interactive. So when you slow down your speaking and you take those breaths, you're giving the other person the opportunity to contribute. So they've been listening to you. Let them have the shot to talk, comment, ask questions. And this way, the message is getting across and you're getting that immediate feedback.
Yeah, and if you are dealing with an audience, it's not a bad idea to put in an exercise where you break the audience into smaller groups to discuss a certain thing that you might have talked about, and then get comments from the group that way. That way they're focusing on the subject matter that you gave them, however it's coming from them.
Right. Communications always works better when it's two ways. You have to be able to respond to what's going on, especially if you're giving a talk or presentation. You need to be able to get feedback from the audience. Now, that feedback isn't always going to be in the form of questions. A lot of times, it's going to be more subtle. If you see a lot of people suddenly, taking out their phones and doing other things, or if you see them fidgeting, you're not getting your message across. You're not connecting with that audience, and you need to adjust what you're doing to better make a connection. So there's visual cues, there's audio cues that your audience is giving you that tells you whether or not you're actually connecting and they understand you. As a speaker, you have to pay attention to that and be able to adapt on the fly. So most of what we've talked about today has been focusing on interpersonal, either one-on-one or in front of a group. But let's face it, a lot of our messages do go through email. So how can you make sure your email messages aren't being misinterpreted? Well, one thing you need to do is to have a clear subject line in your email. A lot of us will just put a subject line of hello, following up. Make the subject line reflect what's in the email. That way, the person that's getting it knows immediately what that email is about. Also, you should keep your email short. Studies have shown that people rarely get past a second paragraph in an email, and sometimes they don't even get to the second paragraph. So you really need to make things short and sweet. A best practice for email is to only cover one topic in an email so that they know this is what the email is about. Your first line basically says what you're talking about. If you have to put details in, bullet point them to make them easy. And then if there's an action, make sure that action stands out so that the person getting the email knows what it is they have to do. But you really do have to craft your email the same way you would craft a talk or a presentation to make sure that people understand what you're saying.
Yeah, as I was preparing for today, you can go online, and I was Googling communications, and there was an article that came up according to the 7 C's communication needs to be. And there, you can actually Google this, but the 7 C's, and you're talking about an email. If you use these, it's going to help you big time with your email. Number one, clear. Obviously, the subject is very, very important, and concise is number two. Concrete, correct, coherent, complete, and courteous. And if you put those 7 C's into a message, it's going to make things brief. It's going to make things concise. There's very, very little room to mess up if you apply those things there. And what you said as far as just portraying one message at a time is really, really important than hitting them, with a war and peace litany of an email.
And that's true. And one of those C's, coherent. When it comes to email, social media, text messages, the best way to make a message coherent is to not reply immediately. So many times a message will come in and you're like, oh, wait a minute, and just type out a quick reply, hit send. Stop. Before you type out that reply, think about what the message says and think about what your reply says. Giving yourself that moment to think about it and not just respond, with a knee-jerk reaction, makes your communication much more coherent. And I think that's very, we've talked about email and in person. We also do a lot of communication over the phone. Phone is a lot easier, especially easier than email, because you can hear the person's tone of voice. So you have that additional context. And it's also generally either one on one or a small group. We don't usually have a lot of people on a phone call at a time. But if you don't understand something, you still need to say, wait a minute, can you repeat that? Can you explain that further? I'm not getting what you're saying.
No, and one
This
of the best things you can do when you're going into a phone call too, especially if it's with a few people or whatever, is to get yourself psyched up, get yourself smiling and so on, because you wherever you're feeling emotionally going into that phone call is going to go right through in your delivery there. It's really even more important over the phone to get yourself psyched up than it is if you're in person, because at least in person people can see your facial expressions and the way you're moving and so on and so forth. So it's really, really important to engage yourself before getting out and engaging people on the phone.
right. And when you're on the phone, you should be on the phone. So many people use a phone call as an excuse to multitask. They'll put their phone on speaker and they'll answer emails or they'll do work. But when you're doing that, you're not listening to the conversation. Going back to what we were saying at the beginning of this podcast, listening is so important. On the phone, we've gotten away from that. We sort of use it as noise while we're doing other things, trying to get more done at once. If you are on a phone call, you should be on that phone call. You shouldn't be doing anything else. Maybe even taking notes on that call if it's a business call or a conference call, so that you've got your thoughts straight and you know what you have to do to follow up with all of the information. But paying attention is crucial. And so many of us especially with phone calls, tend to put it to the wayside. And, we'll take a call while we're driving or while we're eating or while we're doing something else. You wouldn't do that to somebody if they were sitting in front of you. Don't do it to them if they're on the phone. But we've gone over a lot of different methods of communication and the best ways to be clear on them. Most of what we've said about emails also applies to social media. You have to remember, as I said earlier, different methods give you different tools. Misunderstandings happen least frequently when you're face to face, because you have body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, the words, the context. As you move further away, when you move to phone, you lose body language and you lose facial impressions. When you move to email and social media, you also lose tone of voice. So the fewer means you're using to get your message across, the more likely it is that you're misunderstood. So you really do need to be careful. Be clear, concise, and coherent. All right, Chip, we're just about out of time. So, what do you think is the big takeaway for this episode?
Whether you are speaking to an audience or whether you're speaking to people, understanding is the most important thing. It's listening to them, seeking to understand first, because really, when it comes down to communication, when you are communicating with other people, you should be thinking of another C first and foremost, and that's collaborating with them. And that all starts with understanding. So listen, know your audience, and be prepared.
Absolutely. I think for me, the big takeaway is pay attention to the people you're talking to. Get feedback from them, either in terms of questions or nonverbal cues. Pay attention, and this way you make sure your message is getting received and so is theirs. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts. Xvadio Podcast Network is the home of the Success Showcase, and you can find it on Apple Podcast apps, the iTunes Store, Spotify, iHeartRadio apps, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. See you then.